Abandon ship! Jump now! Keep moving! Don't stop!
There's a file sitting in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It is a yellowed piece of paper, stamped in red ink with a single word, magic. It was decoded in the early hours of December 7th, 1941. It was read by senior American officials before the first Japanese bomb ever fell on Pearl Harbor. And for decades, that file, and dozens like it, were locked away, buried beneath layers of classification, bureaucratic silence, and deliberate misdirection. What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not the fringe work of obsessive revisionists. It is a documented, archival, verified account of what American intelligence actually knew before the attack that changed the course of history, and what certain powerful men chose to do with that knowledge, and what they chose not to do. If you ever wondered how the most powerful naval base in the Pacific could be caught completely off guard by an attack force of 353 aircraft and 6 aircraft carriers, an armada that spent 11 days crossing the North Pacific Ocean, then stay with me. Because the answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. It will force you to rethink almost everything you thought you knew about December 7th, 1941. Before we go any further, I want you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell. Every week I bring you stories like this one. Stories buried in classified archives. Stories that the official history textbooks glossed over or ignored entirely. This is a kind of history that matters, and I want to make sure you never miss it. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The story of what Washington knew before Pearl Harbor actually starts not in Hawaii, not in Tokyo, but in a nondescript building in Arlington, Virginia, where a small, exhausted team of American cryptanalysts had accomplished something that the Japanese believed was absolutely impossible. They had broken the Japanese diplomatic cipher. The system was called Purple, named by the Americans, not the Japanese, and it was an extraordinarily complex electromechanical encryption machine that the Imperial Japanese Foreign Ministry used to communicate with its embassies around the world. The Japanese were convinced, with an almost religious certainty, that Purple was unbreakable. They were wrong. The Purple machine was not a simple device. It was a successor to an earlier Japanese cipher system the Americans called Red, which had been broken in the mid-1930s by the Signal Intelligence Service, a tiny, underfunded, almost invisible branch of the United States Army that operated in such secrecy that most of its own government did not know existed. When Japan introduced the Purple machine in 1939, it represented a massive leap in cryptographic sophistication. The machine used telephone stepping switches, the same kind of switch used in commercial telephone exchanges, to perform an extraordinarily complex series of substitutions on the original text, producing ciphertext that the Japanese cryptographers believed no enemy could unravel without possession of the machine itself. They were extraordinarily confident in this belief. Too confident, as it turned out. By the summer of 1940, a team led by William Friedman, widely regarded as the greatest cryptanalyst in American history, had reconstructed the entire Purple machine without ever having seen the original. They built an analog from scratch, working from nothing but the mathematical patterns buried in intercepted ciphertext. The work had taken nearly 2 years, had driven at least one team member to a nervous breakdown, and had required a level of mathematical creativity that Friedman himself later called the most intense intellectual experience of his life. The final breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon in September of 1940. The team had been working 7-day weeks for months. When the last piece clicked into place and they could finally read a Purple message in clear text, several of the men wept. They had done the impossible. And what that achievement gave the United States was direct, real-time access to the most sensitive diplomatic communications of the Empire Japan. The intelligence product generated from these decryptions was given a classification so high it existed above top secret. It was called Magic, and the distribution list for Magic was extraordinarily small. The President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Army Chief of Staff, the Chief of Naval Operations, and a handful of their most senior aides. The commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, were not on that list. That single fact, that one bureaucratic decision about who was entitled to read, which decoded messages, would become the central tragedy of December 7th, 1941. To understand why it mattered so much, you need to understand what magic was actually showing Washington in the autumn of 1941, because what it was showing them was not ambiguous. It was not a picture that required sophisticated interpretation or careful analytical judgment. It was a picture of extraordinary clarity. And what it showed was a Japan that had already made its decision and was simply waiting for the moment to act. The diplomatic cables flowing between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Washington throughout October and November 1941 were the cables of a government engaged in diplomatic theater. The foreign ministry in Tokyo was sending Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and his colleague Saburo Kurusu an increasingly desperate series of instructions. Instructions to keep talking, to keep the negotiations alive, to keep Washington engaged, while simultaneously making absolutely clear to its military commanders that the negotiations were never going to succeed and that the military timeline was fixed. American codebreakers were reading both sides of this performance. They were watching the Japanese government tell its own diplomats, in the most sensitive and classified terms, that what those diplomats were saying to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington was a script, not a sincere offer. In late October 1941, the Magic Intercept began to show a new kind of urgency. Tokyo was pressing Nomura for results, imposing deadlines, warning that if certain American concessions were not obtained by a specific date, the negotiations would be terminated. The first deadline was November 25th. When that deadline passed without agreement, Tokyo extended it to November 29th. The cable announcing the extension added language that has since become among the most quoted in the pre-Pearl Harbor literature. Tokyo told its ambassadors that November 29th was the absolute deadline, and that after that date, things are automatically going to happen. American intelligence decoded that message and passed it up the distribution chain. The President of the United States read those words. Things are automatically going to happen. He knew that Japan had set a clock and that the clock was running out. But knowing that Japan intended to go to war somewhere in the Pacific is not the same as knowing where the blow would fall or when. And this is the first of several crucial distinctions that get lost in the popular telling of the Pearl Harbor story. The Roosevelt administration, reading the magic traffic in the autumn of 1941, was confronted with intelligence that was simultaneously extremely alarming and deeply ambiguous about specifics. Japan was going to war. That was clear. Japan's military operations in Southeast Asia, its movements into French Indochina, its pressure on the Dutch East Indies and their oil fields, its strategic position relative to Malaya and the Philippines, suggested that the primary target of Japanese military expansion was the resource-rich Southern Pacific, not the Central Pacific base at Pearl Harbor. The dominant analytical consensus in Washington, shared by virtually every senior military and intelligence official, was that Japan would move south and west, and that the American position most immediately at risk was the Philippines. This consensus was not unreasonable. It was based on genuine strategic logic. Japan needed oil and rubber and raw materials, and those were in the south. Japan's military expansion in China and Indochina followed a southward and westward trajectory. The Philippines, with their American military garrison, were in the direct path of that expansion and represented a far more immediate obstacle than the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, which was 3,400 miles from the Japanese mainland. From a purely logical standpoint, attacking Pearl Harbor first made sense only if Japan was willing to take an enormous gamble, drawing the full weight of American military power into a war it had no realistic chance of winning over the long term, in exchange for the short-term neutralization of the Pacific Fleet. Most American analysts believed that Japan was not willing to make that gamble. They were wrong. They were wrong because they were thinking like rational actors in the Western strategic framework, and the men planning Japan's Pacific War were not, in that moment, thinking like rational actors in that framework. They were thinking like men who believed that a short, devastating opening blow would shatter American resolve, by Japan time to consolidate its Pacific empire and force a negotiated settlement before American industrial power could be fully mobilized against them. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who conceived and planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood better than any of his colleagues that this gamble was almost certainly a losing one in the long run. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, and seen the American industrial machine up close. He knew what he was unleashing. His plan was built not on confidence, but on desperation, on the conviction that Japan had no better option, and that a stunning opening strike was its only path to a negotiated peace before the inevitable American countermobilization overwhelmed it. Yamamoto was right about what the attack would accomplish militarily in the short term. He was tragically right about what it would accomplish strategically in the long term. Pearl Harbor did not shatter American resolve. It galvanized it, and the American industrial machine that Yamamoto had watched with such awe during his time in the United States proceeded to do exactly what it feared, to produce ships and aircraft and tanks and guns at a rate that Japan could never match, in quantities that made the outcome of the war mathematically predetermined well before the last shot was fired. But all of that was in the future. In November of 1941, in the present tense of history, the clock was counting down, and Washington was reading the intercepts and trying to figure out what Japan was actually going to do and where. Let me tell you about the bomb plot message. On September 24th, 1941, the Japanese Foreign Ministry sent a cable to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. The message was encrypted in a lower-level diplomatic cipher called PAK2, not the Purple System. American intelligence intercepted it and decrypted it. The message instructed the consul to divide Pearl Harbor into a specific grid, 5 distinct areas, and to begin reporting on precise locations of American warships within each grid area, paying particular attention to the positions of battleships. The message asked for information about whether ships were moored together in pairs, whether torpedo nets were in place, and what the general defensive posture of the harbor appeared to be. American intelligence decoded this message on October 9, 1941, 2 months before the attack. When historians and investigators later examined this message, which became known as the bomb plot message because it so clearly described the preparation for a targeted bombing attack on Pearl Harbor, the question they kept asking was simple: who saw this message? What did they make of it? And why was it not forwarded to commanders at Pearl Harbor? The answer to who saw it was clear enough. It was decrypted and distributed through the standard magic-adjacent channels. It reached the desks of senior Navy intelligence officials in Washington. It was seen. The answer to what they made of it was the subject of intense and sometimes heated disagreement in subsequent investigations. The official line, offered by several senior officials who were questioned about the message after the attack, was that it did not appear to be notably different from similar intelligence collection requests that Japanese consular offices sent to other ports around the world. Japanese diplomats everywhere, this argument went, kept track of naval movements as a matter of routine. The Honolulu message was unusual in its specificity, in the grid system, in the particular focus on battleship positions, but not so unusual as to be definitively alarming, or so some officials claimed. The problem with this argument is that subsequent examination of the files showed that no other Japanese consular office in any other port in the world was sending Tokyo the kind of detailed, grid-specific, ship position by ship position intelligence that was flowing from Honolulu. The Honolulu messages were unique. They were, in retrospect, unmistakably the work of intelligence officers conducting pre-strike target acquisition. The grid system, the focus on specific ship classes, the interest in torpedo nets and defensive measures, these were not the casual observations of a diplomat keeping tabs on foreign naval activity. These were the detailed reports of someone preparing the targeting data for an attack. And yet Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the commanders responsible for Pearl Harbor's defense, were never told. The bomb plot message, which landed on the desks of senior Navy officials in Washington 2 months before the attack, was never forwarded to Hawaii. When Admiral Kimmel learned of the message after the attack, he said that if he had received it, he would have understood immediately that Pearl Harbor itself was a target, not merely a general area of Japanese interest in the Pacific. He would have ordered changes to the defensive posture that he did not order because he did not have the information. He was not wrong about what he would have done. He was not wrong that the information would have changed his decisions. The man most directly responsible for failure to forward the bomb plot message was Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Turner was the head of the War Plans Division in the Navy Department, and he had, in the months before Pearl Harbor, effectively colonized the distribution and analysis of naval intelligence in ways that left the actual director of naval intelligence, Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, with limited authority over his own domain. Turner was a brilliant, forceful, and enormously difficult man, a naval officer of exceptional ability whose personal qualities made him nearly impossible to work with and whose institutional aggression had consequences that no one fully understood until after the attack. Turner's reasoning for not forwarding the bomb plot message, as he later explained it, was that Japanese consular offices routinely collected information about naval movements as a matter of standard intelligence practice, and that the Pearl Harbor message, while detailed, did not rise to the level of a specific operational threat indicator. He also argued, and this argument had more merit, that the magic distribution protocols existed precisely to prevent sensitive intelligence from being shared too widely, and that forwarding specific intercept content to commanders in the field, even paraphrased, risked compromising the fact that the Japanese codes had been broken. If Admiral Kimmel or anyone on his staff responded to an intelligence warning in ways that made the Japanese suspect their communications were being read, the cryptographic advantage that magic represented could be lost. The war that was coming might be harder to win if Japan knew its diplomatic communications had been penetrated. This was a real concern, and it was not fabricated after the fact as a justification. The protection of the magic secret was a genuine and legitimate priority, and it shaped decisions about intelligence distribution at every level. But it did not fully explain the failure to provide Pearl Harbor with at least a paraphrased warning, a warning that could have conveyed the substance of threat without revealing its source. Such warnings were technically possible and were in fact provided to some commanders about some threats. They were not provided to Kimmel and Short about the bomb plot evidence. The reasons for that specific failure have never been satisfactorily explained. Turner survived the war and rose to considerable prominence in the post-war Navy, serving as commander of naval forces in the Pacific and receiving numerous honors. He spent years after Pearl Harbor defending his decisions and attacking anyone who questioned them. His relationship with the truth in the Pearl Harbor investigations was, to put it diplomatically, complicated. He was a man of extraordinary confidence in his own judgment, and that confidence made it very difficult for him to acknowledge that his judgment, in this specific and critical instance, had been catastrophically wrong. Now, let me take you somewhere else for a moment, because the story of Pearl Harbor's intelligence failures is not confined to the American side of it. There were warnings flowing into the American system from sources that had nothing to do with magic, and those warnings tell their own story about how a catastrophe can be visible from multiple directions at once while remaining invisible to the people who could have prevented it. In August of 1941, a man named Dusko Popov arrived in New York. Popov was a Yugoslav playboy, a man of considerable charm and very considerable intelligence, who was working simultaneously for British intelligence and German intelligence, a double agent of the First Order, feeding the Abwehr carefully curated false information while passing everything the Germans gave him directly to MI6 in London. He was, by virtually all accounts, one of the most effective double agents of the entire war. Ian Fleming, who worked in naval intelligence during the war and knew Popov personally, later acknowledged him as one of the inspirations for the character of James Bond. The comparison is not unflattering, because Popov was real and his operational record was genuinely remarkable. When Popov arrived in New York in the summer of 1941, he was carrying a questionnaire. The Abwehr had given it to him as part of the standard intelligence collection assignment. He was to travel to the United States, establish his cover, and begin gathering information on a list of topics that German intelligence wanted to know about. The questionnaire covered various subjects relating to American military capabilities and dispositions, but embedded within it, in a section that asked for extremely detailed information about a specific location, was a series of questions about Pearl Harbor. The questionnaire asked about the depth of the water in the harbor, the defensive measures in place, the types and quantities of aircraft at the airfields, the location of ammunition and fuel storage facilities, and the typical disposition of American warships. This questionnaire had been conveyed to Popov using a technique called a microdot, a then novel German intelligence technology that reduced an entire page of text to a lot smaller than a period on a typed page, which could then be concealed within an ordinary letter or document. The microdot technology was itself a significant intelligence find, and Popov turned both the questionnaire and the microdot sample to British intelligence as soon as he had the opportunity. British intelligence passed the information to the FBI. Popov met personally with J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, and showed him the questionnaire. Hoover was, to put it as charitably as possible, not receptive. His reaction to Popov was one of barely concealed contempt. Contempt for man's lifestyle, his foreign background, his work as a double agent, and his evident willingness to discuss his intelligence activities with a kind of candor that Hoover found professionally offensive. Hoover dismissed Popov as a playboy and a fraud, filed the questionnaire away, and never passed its contents to Army or Navy intelligence. He never told anyone in the American military establishment that German intelligence was running a Pearl Harbor-specific collection operation. He never asked the obvious question that the questionnaire demanded. Why were the Germans so specifically and intensely interested in Pearl Harbor? The answer to that question was that Germany and Japan were Axis allies, and Germany was running this collection operation on behalf of Japan. The Pearl Harbor questions in the Abwehr questionnaire were Japanese questions, the same questions, in essence, that the Japanese consul in Honolulu was being asked to answer through the bomb plot instructions. Japan was cross-checking its intelligence through multiple channels simultaneously. It was collecting Pearl Harbor targeting data from its own consul, and it was asking its German allies to collect additional data through their American networks. The convergence of these collection efforts, Japanese diplomatic intelligence, German intelligence, the targeting data flowing into Tokyo from multiple directions, was an unmistakable indicator of intent, and almost none of it reached the commanders at Pearl Harbor. The Soviet Union also possessed relevant intelligence. Richard Sorg was a German journalist based in Tokyo who was, in fact, one of the most brilliant and productive intelligence officers in the history of the Soviet GRU. He had penetrated the German embassy in Tokyo so thoroughly that he was trusted with information of the highest sensitivity, including advanced knowledge of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which he warned Moscow about months before it happened. Moscow, tragically, did not believe him in time to make adequate preparations. But Sorg's intelligence network in Tokyo was real, and it was effective, and by the autumn of 1941, it had produced information suggesting that Japan was planning a major military operation against the United States in the Pacific. Sorg was arrested by Japanese counterintelligence in October 1941, and his network was rolled up before the attack could occur. But the intelligence he and his network had produced was in Moscow's hands. Whether Moscow passed any of this to Washington, and if so, how clearly it was conveyed and how seriously it was taken, remains a matter of genuine historical dispute. What is not in dispute is that the Soviets had penetrated Japanese intentions at a level that gave them advance awareness of the general direction of Japanese strategy, and that their intelligence channels to Washington, however indirect, were open in the autumn of 1941. None of these additional warning streams, not the Popov questionnaire, not the Soviet intelligence, not the British signals intelligence that paralleled and sometimes exceeded the American magic product, was synthesized into a coherent picture that could be acted upon. The American intelligence community in 1941 was not a community in any meaningful sense. It was a collection of competing bureaucracies, each of which guarded its sources and methods jealously, each of which was deeply suspicious of the others, and none of which had either the authority or the institutional culture to force the sharing of critical information across organizational boundaries. The Army and the Navy had separate signals intelligence operations and were, at the command level, openly hostile to each other's access to their most sensitive products. The FBI was a domestic intelligence agency with a director who believed that foreign intelligence was none of his business and who treated the Office of the Coordinator of Information, the forerunner of the CIA, with active contempt. The State Department had its own information flows that it did not routinely share with the military departments. This fragmentation was not a secret or a surprise. It was a known problem that had been identified and criticized long before December 7th. The Roosevelt administration had taken some steps to address it, most notably by creating the Office of the Coordinator of Information under William Donovan. But these reforms were new, incomplete, and resisted at every level by the existing bureaucracies whose turf they threatened. The machinery for synthesizing all of the available intelligence into a coherent, actionable warning simply did not exist in December of 1941. It would take Pearl Harbor itself and the shock of that catastrophe to force the creation of the machinery that should have existed before it. But organizational dysfunction, as complete and as consequential as it was, does not fully explain what happened. because embedded within the organizational story is another story, a story about specific decisions made by specific individuals who had specific information and made specific choices about what to do with it. And when you look at those specific decisions in the specific context of late November and early December 1941, something becomes visible that the purely organizational narrative tends to obscure. Let me take you back to November 25th, 1941, 12 days before the attack. There is a meeting at the White House. Present are President Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark. These are the 6 most powerful men in the American national security establishment. They are meeting to discuss the deteriorating situation with Japan. They know, because a magic interceptor told them, that the diplomatic deadline is imminent, that Japan is preparing for military action, and that the war they've been dreading is almost certainly days or weeks away. Henry Stimson wrote about this meeting in his diary. He noted that the question under discussion was how to handle the expected Japanese military move, and specifically, as he wrote it, how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. That sentence, in Stimson's own handwriting, in his own diary, preserved in the archives of Yale University, is one of the most significant documents in the Pearl Harbor literature. It tells you something important about the state of mind of the senior American leadership in those final days before the attack. I want to be precise about what that sentence means, because it's been interpreted in wildly different ways by different historians over the decades. The revisionist school points to the Stimson diary entry as evidence of deliberate provocation, of a calculated decision to sacrifice the Pacific Fleet to bring America into the war. The mainstream historical consensus, which has held firm through decades of archival research and scholarly debate, is that this interpretation goes too far. The evidence does not support the conclusion that Roosevelt and his advisors orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor or deliberately withheld warning in order to ensure it succeeded. The historical record is not consistent with that level of premeditation. What the Stimson diary entry does show, and this is important enough on its own without the more sensational interpretation, is that the senior American leadership was thinking in terms of political management, not simply military preparation. They knew war was coming. They believed, correctly as it turned out, that American public opinion would support entry into the war more readily if Japan struck first rather than if America struck first. They were thinking about how to structure the moment of entry, how to ensure that it happened in a way that was politically sustainable, how to avoid the appearance of aggression that would complicate the domestic politics of war. Within this frame of political calculation, the specific question of whether Pearl Harbor or the Philippines or Malaya was a target may have seemed less urgently important than the larger strategic question of what to do when a blow fell somewhere. This is not exoneration. This is something more troubling than simple blame. It is the picture of men who were thinking on 2 levels simultaneously, on the level of immediate military threat and on the level of long-term political strategy, and who, in managing the tension between those 2 levels, may have allowed considerations of political calculation to blunt the urgency of military preparation. Whether that blunting was conscious or unconscious, deliberate or merely careless, is a question the diary entries and the archives do not fully answer. What we know for certain is what happened on November 27, 1941, 2 days after the White House meeting. On that day, the War Department and the Navy Department each sent separate warning messages to their Pacific commanders. These messages have been the subject of more detailed analysis than almost any other documents in the Pearl Harbor record, and they reward that analysis. The Army's message to General Short began by declaring that negotiations with Japan appeared to be terminated. It described Japanese future action as unpredictable, but noted that hostile action was possible at any moment. It warned that hostilities could not be avoided. The United States desired that Japan commit the first overt act. It instructed Short to take such reconnaissance and other measures as he deemed necessary, but to avoid alarming the civilian population or committing any overt act until Japan had done so. It also specifically warned that subversive activities within the Hawaiian Islands were to be expected. The Navy's message to Admiral Kimmel was more alarming in its language. It used the phrase war warning, a phrase that had never before appeared in a peacetime American naval communication. It stated that an aggressive move by Japan was expected within the next few days. It described potential targets as the Philippines, Thai or Kra Peninsula, or possibly Borneo. It instructed Kimmel to execute an appropriate defensive deployment. It did not mention Pearl Harbor. Both messages pointed southeast. Both messages directed attention toward the Philippines, toward Malaya, toward the Dutch East Indies. Neither message said anything about the bomb plot intercepts, about the Japanese consul reporting on ship positions in Pearl Harbor, about any intelligence that specifically identified Hawaii as a Japanese target. The men in Washington who wrote these messages had read the bomb plot message. They chose not to include its substance in the warning they sent to Hawaii. Whether that choice was made on security grounds, on analytical grounds, or for other reasons, it had consequences that cannot be undone. General Short received his war warning, read it, and took action against the threats it described. He was told to guard against subversive activities. He clustered his aircraft together on the airfields at Hickam and Wheeler, wing to wing, nose to tail, in a configuration that best protected against ground-level sabotage, and that was catastrophically bad for protection against an air attack. He did not institute long-range aerial reconnaissance. He did not put his forces on full war footing. He sent Washington a message reporting the measures he was taking, and Washington, reading his report and recognizing that it described a defensive posture aimed at sabotage and not at air attack, said nothing. No one called him. No one sent a follow-up message. No one said, "You have misunderstood the warning." Admiral Kimmel received his war warning, read it, and also took action consistent with its content as he understood it. He increased submarine patrols. He established a destroyer screen. He did not order long-range aerial reconnaissance to the north, partly because he lacked the aircraft and crews for sustained reconnaissance in all directions, partly because the warning had told him to look southwest. He too sent a report of his defensive measures to Washington. Washington, reading his report, also said nothing. The failure to correct the misunderstanding, the failure to pick up a telephone or send a clarifying message that said, "The threat to Hawaii is real, look north. The Japanese are specifically watching your harbor," is perhaps the most damning element of the entire pre-attack record, because it is not the failure of an overwhelmed intelligence system drowning in information it cannot process. It is a failure of specific people who had specific information, who read reports that showed their warning had been misunderstood, and who chose to say nothing. In the weeks before December 7th, Admiral Kimmel had also been concerned about the depletion of his destroyer force. Many of his destroyers had been sent to the Atlantic to support the undeclared naval war that Roosevelt was already fighting against German submarines. Kimmel repeatedly requested replacements and was repeatedly told they were unavailable. The consequence was that his long-range patrol capability, the ability to send destroyers out into the surrounding ocean to look for approaching threats, was significantly reduced. This was not a decision made in Hawaii. It was a decision made in Washington by men who were managing a two-ocean naval emergency with one-ocean naval resources. The Pacific had been deliberately downgraded in priority because the Atlantic emergency was considered more acute. This was a rational strategic choice. It was also a choice that left Pearl Harbor more exposed than any of its commanders fully understood. There is also the matter of the Martin Bellinger report, and I want to tell you about it because it is one of the most remarkable documents in the entire Pearl Harbor record. In March of 1941, 9 months before the attack, Rear Admiral Patrick Bellinger and Major General Frederick Martin, the senior aviation commanders in Hawaii, jointly produced a classified threat assessment of the risks facing their command. Their report outlined, with remarkable precision, almost exactly how a Japanese carrier attack on Pearl Harbor would unfold. It identified the northern approaches as the most likely attack vector for an enemy attempting to achieve surprise. It warned that such an attack would most likely come at dawn on a weekend, when American offenses were at their minimum readiness. It warned that the primary targets would be the battleships at anchor. It recommended extensive long-range aerial reconnaissance in all directions, with particular emphasis on the northern approaches, to provide sufficient warning of any approaching threat. That report went up the chain of command. It was read. Its recommendations were never fully implemented. The resources to implement them, the additional patrol aircraft The train crews, the fuel for sustained long-range patrols covering all threat axes, were never provided. The Martin Bellinger report was, in hindsight, a nearly perfect prediction of December 7th. It was also, in hindsight, a nearly perfect statement of the defensive measures that would have prevented December 7th. Neither its prediction nor its recommendations were acted upon. By November 1941, the patrol squadrons in Hawaii were flying what was called a deferred reconnaissance schedule, meaning they were conserving aircraft and crew hours to maintain readiness, and conducting only limited patrols. The northern approaches to Oahu received no regular aerial surveillance at all. On the morning of December 7th, there were no American patrol aircraft flying north of Hawaii. There was no early warning system adequate to detect an incoming airstrike at meaningful range. There was a radar installation, the new and experimental SCR-270 mobile radar set, but it was staffed by undertrained operators. Its warning protocols were not yet fully established, and its coverage was limited to certain sectors. The Japanese strike force, the Kido Butai, 6 fleet carriers carrying 414 aircraft, had departed the Kurio Islands on November 26, 1941, under a cloud of deliberate communications deception. The fleet maintained strict radio silence for the entire voyage. To reinforce the illusion that the carriers were still in their home waters, Japanese naval radio operators in the inland sea continued to transmit dummy messages using the carriers' call signs. American radio intelligence intercepted these dummy transmissions and was thoroughly deceived by them. The commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet's daily intelligence report on December 2, 1941, 5 days before the attack, stated flatly that the locations of all Japanese carriers were unknown. The fleet had simply vanished from the American intelligence picture, hidden in the vast cold spaces of the North Pacific. The operational security of the Kido Butai during its transit was, by any measure, exceptional. The fleet took a northern route specifically chosen for its remoteness from commercial shipping lanes and regular patrol routes. The weather during the voyage was terrible. Overcast skies, frequent fog, heavy seas, but the poor weather was also a shield. No civilian vessel was likely to be operating in those waters under those conditions, and the risk of accidental discovery was genuinely low. The fueling at sea, which was required for a voyage of that distance, was conducted with extraordinary care. No aircraft flew within detection range of fleet for the entire 11 days of its transit. This matters for the historical record because it pushes back against the most extreme versions of the conspiracy narrative. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not, in its operational dimensions, a trivially preventable event. The Japanese strike force was genuinely invisible to American intelligence for the duration of its transit, and genuinely difficult to locate even if American forces had been specifically searching for it. The Northern Pacific is an enormous ocean, and in 1941 there was no satellite reconnaissance, no airborne early warning, no network of sensors capable of tracking a fleet through those waters. The operational surprise that Japan achieved on December 7th was the product of genuine excellence in Japanese military planning and operational security. It was not solely the product of American failure. What was genuinely preventable, and what the documentary record shows was not prevented, despite the availability of information that should have triggered different decisions, was a degree of vulnerability at Pearl Harbor itself. An American commander who had been told about the bomb plot messages, who knew that Japan was specifically collecting targeting data on Pearl Harbor, who had been ordered to institute long-range aerial reconnaissance in the northern approaches, who had been placed on a genuine war footing rather than a sabotage prevention footing. That commander would not have prevented the attack, but he might have provided enough warning to scramble fighters, to get ships underway, to man the anti-aircraft batteries. The death toll would likely have been lower. The damage would likely have been less catastrophic. The strategic shock of the attack would have been different in kind. That difference between the Pearl Harbor that happened and the Pearl Harbor that might have happened with better intelligence and better warning is the measure of the failure that preceded it. Then there is the winds code, and I need to tell you about it because it is the strangest and most unresolved element of the entire pre-attack record. In late November of 1941, as American and British signals intelligence officers were monitoring the deterioration of Japanese-American relations with increasing anxiety, they became aware of a Japanese foreign ministry communication that had established a system of emergency signals. These signals would be embedded in ordinary weather forecast broadcasts and would tell Japanese embassies around the world that diplomatic relations with specific countries were about to be severed. The signal for the United States was the phrase east wind, rain, embedded in a weather forecast. North wind, cloudy, meant the Soviet Union. West wind, clear, meant Britain. American signals intelligence was instructed to monitor Japanese weather broadcasts around the clock for the appearance of these phrases. The monitoring was intensive and sustained. Dozens of American Navy and Army personnel were assigned to this task. The files they generated, the logs of monitored broadcasts, were supposed to be preserved as part of the permanent intelligence record. In the days before December 7, 1941, several senior American Navy officers later testified under oath that they had monitored or seen reports of a winds execute message, a broadcast containing the phrase east wind, rain, signaling the impending break with the United States. Commander Lawrence Safford, one of the most experienced and respected signals intelligence officers in the Navy, a man who had spent his career in this work, who was present throughout the relevant period, and who had no obvious motive for fabrication, testified before the Joint Congressional Committee with extraordinary specificity. He described receiving a message on December 4, 1941, 3 days before the attack. He described its content. He described what he did with it and to whom he showed it. He was detailed, consistent, and certain. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner testified with equal certainty that no such message had ever been received. He was equally detailed and equally certain. Between them sat an impossible contradiction, because two men who are both telling the truth cannot simultaneously be certain of mutually exclusive facts about a single discrete event. The logs that would have resolved the contradiction have never been found. Whether they were destroyed in the chaos of the immediate post-attack period, lost in the bureaucratic upheaval that followed the attack, or deliberately suppressed by someone with an interest in preventing their discovery, is a question that the investigations of 1945 and 1946 were unable to answer. Their absence became, in the subsequent decades, one of the most persistently troubling elements of the Pearl Harbor record. Not because their absence proves any particular theory, but because their absence makes it impossible to definitively close the question. At 7:02 in the morning on December 7, 1941, Private Joseph Lockhart and Private George Elliott were at the Opana Mobile Radar Station on the northern tip of Oahu. Their regular shift had ended at 7 a.m., but Lockhart was using the interval before their transport arrived to give Elliott additional practice on the SCR 270 equipment. At 7:02, the screen showed an anomalous return. So large, so diffuse, so clearly representing a massive formation of aircraft that Lockhart's first instinct was that the equipment was malfunctioning. He ran through his diagnostics. The equipment was functioning normally. What he was seeing was real. The return was 136 miles to the north, approaching fast. Lockhart called the Fort Shafter Information Center and reported to the duty officer, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. Tyler was new. He had staffed the information center for only one previous full shift. 3 days earlier, he received Lockhart's report, and he told him not to worry about it. He assumed the return was the expected flight of American B-17s inbound from the mainland that morning. He dismissed the warning and went to get his breakfast. Lockhart and Elliott continued to track the incoming aircraft for another 20 minutes, watching the return grow on their screen as the range closed. At 7:39, they lost the return in the ground clutter close to shore. 6 minutes later, at 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fell on Battleship Row. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours. When it was over, 2,403 Americans were dead. 1,178 more were wounded. The battleship Arizona had exploded and sank with 1,177 of her crew aboard. Their bodies remain in the wreck to this day. The Oklahoma had capsized. The California, the West Virginia, and the Nevada had been sunk or run aground. 188 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. The Pacific Fleet's battleship force had been devastated in a single Sunday morning. America was at war. The investigation that the public initially received, the Roberts Commission, convened in December of 1941 and reporting in January of 1942, was not a genuine investigation. It was, in retrospect, a damage control exercise. The commission, chaired by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, concluded that Kimmel and Short had failed in their duty and cleared Washington officials of significant blame. The commission did not have access to magic. It did not know about the bomb plot message. It was working in the dark by design, because the Roosevelt administration was not about to allow a wartime investigation to expose the fact that the Japanese diplomatic codes had been broken. The magic secret was too valuable to sacrifice on the altar of historical accountability, even when that accountability involved the reputations of two officers who were being blamed for failures that originated, at least in part, in Washington. Kimmel and Short were relieved of command on December 17, 1941. Both men spent the rest of their lives in that cloud of blame, defending their records, demanding access to the intelligence files that had been withheld from them, insisting that they had been used as scapegoats for failures that were not primarily theirs. Kimmel testified before the Joint Congressional Committee in 1945 with a fury and a precision that shook several of the committee members. He wanted answers. He had been denied the information he needed to do his job, and 2,403 of the men under his command had died, and the government that had denied him that information had then blamed him for the consequences. His outrage was, by any measure, understandable. The Joint Congressional Committee investigation of 1945 to 1946 was the most thorough examination of the Pearl Harbor record that had yet been conducted. The magic files were finally made available. The bomb plot messages were entered into the record. Witnesses who had previously been unable to speak freely about classified matters were now permitted to testify. The 40 volumes of testimony and documentation that resulted remained the primary archival resource for Pearl Harbor research. But the investigation was also, as I said earlier, profoundly shaped by the political environment of 1946. The majority Democratic members were not going to produce a report that condemned Franklin Roosevelt, who had just died and who was seen by half the country as the greatest president of the century. The minority Republicans were not going to produce a report that exonerated him. The result was a document that distributed blame broadly, documented the failures extensively, and arrived at conclusions that satisfied no one fully. The questions at the center of the controversy, whether senior Washington officials had deliberately withheld warning, whether political calculation had been allowed to compromise military preparation, were documented but not definitively adjudicated. In 1995, a Department of Defense investigation concluded that blame for the disaster should be broadly distributed, including to officials in Washington. In 2000, Congress passed a resolution declaring that Kimmel and Short had been unfairly blamed and deserved a posthumous upgrade in their retired rank. The resolution passed. The rank upgrade was not implemented. The resolution was symbolic. The record was acknowledged but never fully corrected. I want to tell you about one more document, because it is in some ways the most haunting in the entire pre-attack record. On December 6, 1941, the day before the attack, the Japanese consulate in Honolulu transmitted a final message to Tokyo. American signals intelligence intercepted and decrypted it. The message reported that no barrage balloons were in evidence over Pearl Harbor, the floating cables that would have made a low-level torpedo attack more difficult. It noted that no torpedo nets were visible around the American battleships. It observed that the general defensive posture of the naval installation appeared normal and that there was no sign of heightened alertness. It was, in essence, a final pre-strike reconnaissance report, confirming that the target was accessible, unprotected, and unaware. This message was decrypted in Washington on December 6, 1941. It was not forwarded to Pearl Harbor. By the time it had been processed through the standard channels, it was December 7th, and the Japanese aircraft were already in the air. There is also the matter of the pilot message, the first 13 parts of Japan's final diplomatic note to the United States, which were decoded and delivered to senior Washington officials on the evening of December 6. The note was not a declaration of war, but it was clearly the communication of a government about to break diplomatic relations. President Roosevelt read it that evening and reportedly said simply, "This means war." The 14th and final part of the note, along with instructions to deliver it at a specific time the following morning, a time that corresponded almost exactly with the moment of the Pearl Harbor attack, was decoded on the morning of December 7th. General Marshall received information about the specific delivery time that morning and attempted to send an urgent warning to the commanders in Hawaii. The warning was delayed. Some accounts say Marshall chose to send it by commercial cable rather than by available military radio channels, a decision that has never been fully explained, and it arrived in Honolulu after the attack had already begun. It was delivered by a bicycle messenger who had no idea that the island was under attack. Why Marshall sent his warning by commercial cable rather than the military radio channels that were available to him is a question that Marshall himself never convincingly answered. He testified that the military channels were experiencing atmospheric interference that morning. Others disputed this. The question remains open, sitting alongside the winds code controversy and the bomb plot distribution failure, as one of the permanently unresolved puzzles in the Pearl Harbor record. The men who died on the morning of December 7, 1941, did not know any of this. They did not know about magic or the bomb plot message or Stimson's diary entry, or Turner's decision, or the winds code, or the pop-off questionnaire buried in Hoover's files. They woke up on a Sunday morning in what was, for many of them, one of the most beautiful places they had ever been posted. The air was warm, the harbor was calm, the sky was blue. Some of them were eating breakfast. Some were sleeping in. Some were on deck, watching the morning light on the water. Some were preparing for church services. None of them were preparing for war, because no one had told them that war was minutes away. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over the mountains at 7:49 in the morning, the sailors and soldiers at Pearl Harbor had no context for what they were seeing. Several of the first men to spot the incoming aircraft assumed it was an American training exercise, until the bombs started falling and the machine gun fire started and the harbor erupted in flame and smoke and the screaming of men die in a war that had never been declared. 2,403 Americans died in those 2 hours. Their average age was barely over 20. The youngest was 17, having enlisted by lying about his age. Their names are inscribed on white marble. Their bodies, in many cases, remain in the wreck of the ships that became their tombs. The questions that their deaths raise, what was known, what was done with what was known, what might have been different, are questions that the archives answer only partially. The documents are there. The magic stamps are on the files. The bomb plot message is preserved. Stimson's diary entry is in his own handwriting. The testimony of the investigations is published and available. What the archives cannot provide, what no archive can provide, is the inner calculus of the men who held these documents, who read these warnings, who made these decisions, their reasoning, their certainties, and their doubts. The moments when each of them decided that what he knew was not sufficient or not appropriate, or not safe to share with the men defending the harbor that the intelligence picture said was being targeted. History does not always deliver justice. It does not deliver simple verdicts for complex events. What it delivers, if you're willing to go looking in the right places, in the archives, in the classified files that have slowly been opened over the decades, in the testimony of men who could not or would not speak freely while they were alive, is something more valuable than a verdict. It delivers the texture of how catastrophe actually happens, not in a single moment of treachery or a single catastrophic failure, but in the accumulation of small decisions, institutional failures, political calculations, and human fallibility that together create a condition in which the preventable becomes inevitable. The questions Pearl Harbor raises recur in every generation. They recurred on September 11, 2001, when the 9/11 Commission found, with almost eerie precision, the same structural failures in the American intelligence community that had produced Pearl Harbor 60 years earlier. The same failure to share information across organizational boundaries, the same analytical fixation on expected threat vectors, the same gap between strategic warning and tactical preparation. The specific failures were different in their details. The structural failure was nearly identical. The people who died in the World Trade Center did not know what their government knew any more than the sailors on the Arizona knew what theirs knew. They trusted that the people responsible for their safety were doing everything that could be done. This is perhaps the deepest obligation of democratic government, to ensure that the men and women it places in harm's way have the information they need to protect themselves and each other, to ensure that what is known at the top flows to those who need it at the front. That obligation was not fulfilled in November and December of 1941. The men of the Pacific Fleet paid for that failure with their lives. Their names are on the wall. The documents are in the archives. The questions remain open. If this video gave you something to think about, if it changed the way you understand Pearl Harbor or American intelligence or the way that powerful governments handle dangerous knowledge, please share it with someone who needs to hear this story, like this video. It is how the algorithm knows that serious, evidence-based archival history matters, and it is how I can keep making it. Subscribe if you haven't already. I will see you next week, when we go deeper into another chapter of the history they never fully told you. Let me go deeper into something that the standard Pearl Harbor narrative almost always passes over too quickly: the internal Japanese decision-making process that produced the attack in the first place. Because understanding why Japan struck Pearl Harbor and why it struck when it did is essential to understanding the full context of the intelligence failures that preceded it. The attack did not emerge fully formed from a single strategic mind. It was the product of years of bureaucratic struggle within the Imperial Japanese military establishment, a struggle between factions with radically different views about Japan's strategic future, and the resolution of that struggle determined not just that Japan would go to war with America, but when and how. The Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor was fundamentally Yamamoto's decision, but it was a decision he forced on a military establishment that was deeply resistant to it. The Imperial Japanese Navy's war planning staff, the same staff that would be responsible for executing any attack, was initially opposed to Pearl Harbor operation. Their preferred war plan called for a defensive-offensive strategy, allowed the American Pacific Fleet to advance across the Pacific in response to Japanese actions in Southeast Asia, attrited through submarine and aircraft attacks along the way, and then destroy in a decisive fleet engagement somewhere in the Western Pacific, probably in waters close to Japan where geography favored the defense. This was a conservative plan, grounded in the tradition of Japanese naval doctrine that stretched back to Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905. It was also, in Yamamoto's view, a plan for losing the war. Yamamoto understood, with a clarity that eluded most of his colleagues, that Japan could not win prolonged war against the United States. The American industrial capacity was simply too great. If Japan allowed the war to become a war of attrition, Japan would lose. The only path to a Japanese victory, or at least a negotiated settlement on terms Japan could accept, was a war that ended quickly before American industry could fully mobilize. And the only way to produce a quick war was to deal the United States such a stunning blow at the outset that Washington would be willing to negotiate rather than fight. Yamamoto pushed the Pearl Harbor plan through a reluctant naval general staff in the autumn of 1941 with a combination of strategic argument and personal ultimatum. He made clear to his superiors that if the Pearl Harbor attack was not approved, he would resign his command. Given his extraordinary prestige within the Navy, he was widely regarded as Japan's greatest naval commander. His resignation would have been a devastating blow to morale and to the credibility of the war planning process. The Naval General Staff capitulated. The Pearl Harbor attack was approved, and the planning for the most ambitious naval operation in history began in earnest. The planning was meticulous, and the execution was brilliant. Yamamoto's chief planner, Rear Admiral Minoru Genda, one of the most creative and technically accomplished aviation officers in the Japanese Navy, addressed and solved a series of problems that had previously seemed insuperable. The shallow water of Pearl Harbor, which was only about 40 feet deep in most areas where the battleships were anchored, made conventional torpedo attacks impossible. Standard aerial torpedoes, dropped from aircraft, would plunge much deeper than 40 feet before leveling out, and would simply bury themselves in the harbor bottom before reaching their targets. Genda and his engineering team developed modified torpedoes with wooden fins that limited their depth of plunge and allowed them to function in shallow water. The testing and refinement of this technology was one of the most technically demanding elements of the entire operation, and its success was one of the reasons the attack was so devastating. Genda also addressed the problem of keeping the attack secret from American reconnaissance. He designed the route across the North Pacific specifically to minimize the chance of detection, and he established the radio silence protocols that prevented any American signals intelligence from tracking the fleet. He rehearsed the air crews intensively, using a mock-up of Pearl Harbor constructed at Kagoshima Bay, whose geography was similar to that of Oahu. He developed the sequencing of the attack to maximize damage. High-level bombers targeting the battleships at anchor, torpedo bombers attacking the ships from multiple angles simultaneously, dive bombers targeting the airfields to prevent American fighters from rising to intercept. The coordination required for this multi-wave, multi-axis attack was extraordinarily complex, and the Japanese Navy achieved it with a precision that astonished even those who had planned it. None of this planning was visible to American intelligence. The training exercises at Kagoshima Bay were conducted in secrecy. The technical development of the shallow water torpedoes was kept within a very small circle. The strategic planning sessions within the Naval General Staff were protected by the most rigorous security protocols in the Japanese military. American human intelligence in Japan, which was meager to begin with, because Japan was a closed society extraordinarily difficult to penetrate, had no access to any of this. What American intelligence did have access to, through the magic intercepts, was the diplomatic context of the coming war. The deterioration in negotiations, the ultimatums and deadlines, the instructions to destroy code books, the evidence of final preparations for a break in relations. What it lacked was operational intelligence about the specific target, the specific timing, the specific nature of the attack. The gap between strategic warning, Japan is going to war, and tactical warning, Japan is going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th with carrier-based aircraft, was a gap that the available intelligence could not fully bridge. And in that gap, 2,403 Americans died. I want to spend some time now on a figure who is often overlooked in the standard Pearl Harbor narrative, but who deserves far more attention than he receives. Admiral Harold Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations. Stark was, by November of 1941, one of the 2 or 3 people in Washington with the most comprehensive view of the intelligence picture as it related to the coming Japanese attack. He was on the magic distribution list. He received the diplomatic intercepts. He had access to the naval intelligence assessments. He was present at the November 25th White House meeting that Stimson described in his diary. He signed off on the November 27th war warning to Kimmel, and he was one of the men who read Kimmel's response to that warning and chose to say nothing to correct the misunderstanding. Stark has generally escaped the sharpest historical criticism of the Pearl Harbor disaster, partly because he was a likable and personally admirable figure, partly because the blame for naval intelligence failures attached most heavily to Turner, and partly because Stark's post-war testimony, while not always fully consistent with the documentary record, was delivered with a quiet dignity that made it difficult to press him too hard. But the record shows that Stark was one of the key figures in the chain of failures that left Pearl Harbor unprotected, and his decisions or his non-decisions, in the days before December 7th, deserved the same scrutiny that Kimmel and Turner and Marshall have received. Stark was also, it should be noted, a man who understood that something catastrophic was about to happen and who was consumed by anxiety about it in the final weeks before the attack. His correspondence from November of 1941 shows a man under enormous psychological strain, wrestling with his responsibilities, aware of the danger, and uncertain about what more he could do. He was not indifferent. He was not callous. He was a human being caught in an impossible position, trying to manage competing responsibilities with inadequate tools, making decisions that would prove to have been wrong without knowing in the moment that they were wrong. This is the human face of the Pearl Harbor disaster that gets lost when the story is told too schematically. As a story of heroes and villains, of deliberate malice and righteous sacrifice, the men in Washington who failed to warn Pearl Harbor were not, for the most part, monsters. They were fallible human beings operating within systems that were not adequate to the challenges they faced, making decisions under pressure and uncertainty, failing in ways that were partly the product of individual failure, and partly the product of systemic failure, and partly the product of a kind of collective blindness that is one of the most dangerous phenomena in national security decision-making. The collective blindness is worth examining in some detail, because it is the element of the Pearl Harbor story that recurs most persistently in subsequent intelligence failures. The technical term for it is mirror imaging, the tendency of intelligence analysts to assume that adversaries will behave in ways that are rational and predictable according to the analyst's own strategic framework. American analysts looking at Japan in November of 1941 applied their own strategic logic to Japanese decision-making and concluded that attacking Pearl Harbor, which was so far from Japan's immediate strategic objectives, and which would so certainly produce a devastating American response, was not something a rational adversary would do. They were right that it wasn't rational in any conventional strategic sense. They were catastrophically wrong in assuming that Japanese decision-makers were operating within a conventional strategic framework. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was, from a certain angle, an act of strategic desperation. Japan was losing the war it was already fighting. The war in China, the war against its own resource constraints, the war against American oil embargo that was slowly strangling its military machine. The alternatives to the Pearl Harbor gamble, accepting American demands, withdrawing from China, abandoning the empire that Japan had spent decades building, were unacceptable to the military and political leadership that had staked its legitimacy on expansion. The Pearl Harbor attack was not the action of a government operating from a position of confidence. It was the action of a government that had convinced itself it had no other options, and that a stunning blow against the American fleet might, just might, produce the negotiated settlement that peaceful negotiation had failed to achieve. American analysts, applying their own framework of rational strategic calculation, could not fully imagine this reasoning. They looked at the balance of forces, at the enormous disparity in industrial capacity between Japan and the United States, and concluded that Japan must know it could not win a war against America, and therefore would not start one. They were right about the balance of forces. They were wrong about the conclusion Japan would draw from it. The magic intercepts, which showed so clearly that Japan was determined to go to war, were processed through this analytical framework, and the result was a consistent consensus that the blow, when it fell, would fall in Southeast Asia, because that was where the rational strategic logic pointed, because that was where Japan's immediate material interests lay, because striking the Philippines or Malaya made strategic sense in a way that striking Pearl Harbor, 3,400 miles from the Japanese home islands, simply did not. Not if you were thinking about it the way the American analysts were thinking about it. This analytical failure is not the same thing as the organizational failures I described earlier. The organizational failures, the bomb plot message not forwarded, the WINS code logs that disappeared, the warning messages that pointed the wrong direction. These were specific, concrete failures that could be attached to specific people and specific decisions. The analytical failure was something different, a shared assumption held by virtually the entire American intelligence and military establishment that turned out to be wrong. No single person was responsible for the assumption. No single decision produced it. It was a collective product of an intelligence culture that had not yet developed the discipline to question its own premises. The consequence of that analytical failure was that even when specific pieces of intelligence, like the bomb plot message, pointed in a direction that contradicted consensus, the contradiction was not perceived. The bomb plot message was seen through the lens of the assumption that Japan was interested in the Pacific broadly, not Pearl Harbor specifically. The extraordinary specificity of the message, the grid system, the focus on battleship positions, was not perceived as extraordinary because the lens through which it was being read did not recognize Pearl Harbor as a priority target. If the analysts had started from the question, where would Japan strike if it decided to attack the United States directly, rather than where's Japan's immediate strategic interest in Southeast Asia, the bomb plot message would have looked very different. But that question was not being asked, because the consensus was that Japan would not strike the United States directly. The failure to ask the right question is the most fundamental intelligence failure. It is more fundamental than organizational dysfunction, more fundamental than bureaucratic rivalry, more fundamental than individual negligence. It is a failure of imagination that allows the unimaginable to happen. And here, at last, is why Pearl Harbor still matters. Not as a historical curiosity, not as a political controversy, but as a lesson in the limits of intelligence and the catastrophic consequences of those limits. The men who read the magic intercepts in the autumn of 1941 were not stupid or lazy or indifferent. They were professionals, many of them exceptionally talented, doing their best with the tools and frameworks available to them. They failed because their frameworks were inadequate to reality they were trying to understand. They saw what they expected to see, and they did not see what they did not expect to see. And 2,403 Americans died in the gap between their expectation and reality. Every generation since has had to learn some version of this lesson, the hard way. It was learned again at the Bay of Pigs, where American analysts assumed that a popular uprising would follow the landing and were wrong. It was learned again when the Soviet Union collapsed, which virtually no American analyst had predicted. It was learned again on September 11, 2001. It is being learned again and again in every decade, because the human tendency to see what we expect to see is not a correctable design flaw. It is a fundamental feature of human cognition, and the best we can do is build intelligence systems that systematically challenge our assumptions rather than confirming them. Pearl Harbor produced, among other reforms, the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and a significant reorganization of the American intelligence community. But it did not produce, and perhaps could not have produced, the elimination of the mirror imaging problem. The CIA and the intelligence community it anchored have been wrong in consequential ways many times since 1947. The specific failures have been different. The structural vulnerability has been persistent. The only true prophylactic against the kind of failure that produced Pearl Harbor is a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to ask, systematically and insistently, the question, what are we not seeing? What are we assuming that might be wrong? What would the attack look like from the perspective of the adversary, not from the perspective of our own strategic logic? These are uncomfortable questions to ask, because they require acknowledging the limits of your own knowledge and the fallibility of your own judgment. They are also, in the intelligence business, the most important questions there are. The men who died at Pearl Harbor deserve, at minimum, the honest accounting that their government took so long to provide. They deserve the acknowledgement that what happened to them was not simply bad luck, not simply the consequence of Japanese brilliance, not simply the fog of war. It was, to a significant and documentable degree, the consequence of specific human failures, failures of intelligence distribution, failures of analytical judgment, failures of institutional communication, and possibly failures of political will, that left them more vulnerable than they needed to be. Their names are on the wall. The documents are in the archives. The questions have been asked, and some of them have been answered, and some of them remain permanently open because the men who could have answered them took the answers to their graves. That is history. That is what it looks like when you examine it honestly, without the comforting myths, without the clean narratives that protect reputations and resolve ambiguities that were never actually resolved. Pearl Harbor was a catastrophe that did not have to be as catastrophic as it was. The difference between what happened and what might have happened, if the bomb plot message had been forwarded, if the war warnings had pointed north as well as south, if someone had picked up the telephone and said to Admiral Kimmel, "The Japanese are watching your harbor, be ready," that difference is measured in lives. American lives. Young men who died on a Sunday morning in paradise because the system that was supposed to protect them had failed in multiple ways in the weeks and months before the attack. Remember that the next time you hear Pearl Harbor described simply as a surprise attack, it was a surprise. But it was a surprise that was substantially preventable, and the documents to prove it had been sitting in the National Archives, stamped in red with the word magic, for more than 80 years. If this video gave you something to think about, please share it. Hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you next week. There is an aspect of the Pearl Harbor story that I have not yet addressed, and it is one that tends to make people uncomfortable precisely because it complicates the clean moral narrative of American innocence and Japanese aggression. I am not going to shy away from it, because this channel is about telling the full truth of history, and the full truth of Pearl Harbor requires addressing the context in which the attack occurred. By December 1941, the United States was not, in any meaningful sense, neutral in the Second World War. It was supplying Britain with weapons under Lend-Lease, providing naval escorts for Atlantic convoys, and had been engaged in an undeclared naval war against German submarines in the Atlantic since the summer of 1941. It had imposed a crippling oil embargo on Japan in the summer of 1941 that cut off approximately 80% of Japan's oil imports, threatening to bring the Japanese military machine to a halt within 2 years. It had frozen Japanese assets in the United States. It had provided diplomatic and material support to China, which Japan had been at war with since 1937. None of this means that Japan was justified in attacking Pearl Harbor, or that the attack was anything other than an act of military aggression against a country with which Japan was nominally at peace. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a war crime by any reasonable definition, a surprise attack, without declaration of war, on a military installation and the personnel assigned to it. The men who died at Pearl Harbor were victims of an act of aggression. Full stop. Nothing in the political context of 1941 changes that. But the political context does help explain why Japan reached the conclusion it reached. That war with the United States was inevitable, that the embargo constituted an existential threat to Japan's military capacity, and that the only path forward was to strike before the embargo's effects became irreversible. This is not an apology for Japan. It is an attempt to understand, which is what serious history requires. The Roosevelt administration understood that the oil embargo would be perceived by Japan as an existential provocation. There were officials within the administration, most notably Secretary of State Hull and Secretary of War Stimson, who argued that the embargo should be calibrated carefully, that cutting off Japan's oil completely would force the very military confrontation that Washington was trying to avoid. They were overruled by a combination of domestic political pressure and conviction, held by others in the administration, that a firm stand was necessary to deter Japanese expansion. The embargo went into full effect in August of 1941. For months later, Japanese aircraft were over Pearl Harbor. Whether the Roosevelt administration anticipated that the embargo would lead directly to war, and whether they welcomed that outcome as a means of bringing America into the war more broadly, is one of the most debated questions in the Pearl Harbor historiography. The Stimson diary entry suggests that at least some senior officials were thinking in these terms by late November. The public record suggests that the decision to impose a full embargo was made without full consideration of the military consequences. What is not in dispute is that the embargo, combined with American diplomatic demands that Japan withdraw from China, demands that Japan's military and political leadership were never going to accept, created conditions in which Japan decided that war was its only option. Roosevelt himself understood by late November of 1941 that the diplomatic process had failed. The magic intercepts made that unmistakably clear. The question that he and his advisors were wrestling with in those final days before the attack was not whether war with Japan was coming. It was, but how to enter in a way that was politically sustainable and strategically coherent. The Roosevelt administration had been trying since 1939 to find a way to bring the United States into the war against Nazi Germany. Germany, however, had been careful not to provide the direct provocation that would allow Roosevelt to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Japan, through its alliance with Germany and its aggressive expansion in Asia, had now created the circumstances that Germany had not. If Japan struck first, America would enter the war against both Japan and, through Germany's inevitable declaration of war in response, against Germany as well. This calculation, this strategic logic, was not secret. It was the understood context within which the Roosevelt administration's war planning was conducted. And it is the context within which the decisions in November and December of 1941 must be understood, not as simple negligence or simple betrayal, but as a decision-making of a government that was trying simultaneously to manage an immediate military threat and to navigate a complex strategic and political situation, and that, in the process, may have allowed the strategic and political considerations to dominate the immediate military ones in ways that proved catastrophic. I want to be clear about something. The men who died at Pearl Harbor were not sacrificed. The Roosevelt administration did not deliberately arrange for them to die. But the record shows that the senior leadership of the United States government, in the weeks before December 7th, was thinking more about how to manage America's entry into the war than about how to ensure that the people at Pearl Harbor were as well protected as possible. And in that gap between strategic management and tactical protection, 2,403 Americans were killed. The responsibility for their deaths is distributed across time and across institutions. It belongs to the Japanese military planners who conceived and executed the attack. It belongs to the organizational systems that prevented the sharing of intelligence. It belongs to the individual officials who made specific decisions that left Pearl Harbor with less warning and less preparation than the available intelligence warranted. And it belongs in some measure to the broader failure of American democracy to build the intelligence and national security institutions it needed before the war came to it, rather than after. The lesson is not that democracy is weak or that democratic governments are incapable of protecting their citizens. The lesson is that democratic institutions, like all human institutions, are subject to the full range of human failure, to bureaucratic dysfunction, to individual ambition and rivalry, to the gap between what is known and what is communicated, to the tendency of political calculation to crowd out military preparation. These are failures that can be reduced and managed but never entirely eliminated. The best defense against them is a democratic public that demands accountability, that insists on knowing what its government knew and when, and what it did with that knowledge, that refuses to be satisfied with official narratives that protect reputations at the expense of truth. The magic files in the National Archives are available. The bomb plot message is there. The testimony of the congressional hearings is published. The Stimson diary is at Yale. The story of Pearl Harbor, the full story, not the sanitized version, is accessible to anyone willing to look for it. The question is whether enough people are willing to look. The men who died on the Arizona and the Oklahoma and the California deserve to live. They deserved, at minimum, the warning that the intelligence picture warranted. They deserve commanders who had been given the information they needed to protect them. They deserved a government that prioritized their lives over its political calculations. They did not receive those things, and the record of why they did not receive them is preserved in the archives for anyone willing to examine it honestly. That is what I have tried to do today. I have tried to tell you the truth of Pearl Harbor. Not the myth, not the conspiracy, not the official story, but the documented, archival, evidence-based account of what was known, what was done with what was known, and what the consequences were. It is a story that does not resolve neatly, that does not identify a single villain or a single moment of failure, that demands more from you as a viewer than a simple story of surprise and heroism. It demands that you sit with the complexity, the ambiguity, the genuinely unresolved questions, and that you draw from them not a verdict but an understanding. Understanding how Pearl Harbor happened is not an academic exercise. It is preparation for the next time, because there will be a next time. There always is. When an intelligence community is overwhelmed, when organizational systems fail, when political calculation crowds out military preparation, when the unthinkable comes out north and finds us looking the wrong way, every generation gets its Pearl Harbor. The only defense is the knowledge of what happened before. The real knowledge, the archival knowledge, the knowledge that comes not from the textbooks but from the documents themselves. The documents are there. The questions are there. And the obligation to ask them honestly, insistently, without deference to comfort or to reputation. That obligation belongs to all of us. Let me take you back into the operational details of December 7th itself, because the story of that morning, minute by minute, decision by decision, is its own kind of evidence about the nature of the failure that preceded it. It is not enough to say that Pearl Harbor was surprised. You need to understand the precise texture of that surprise, what it looked like from the inside, how it unfolded in real time, to fully grasp what the advance warning could have changed. The Japanese First Air Fleet launched its aircraft in 2 waves. The first wave launched at 6 a.m. local time, approximately 230 miles north of Oahu. It consisted of 183 aircraft, 40 torpedo planes, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighter escorts. The planes formed up in the darkness and turned south toward Oahu. Their commander, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, was flying the lead high-level bomber. He would transmit the famous signal, Tora, 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 meaning tiger, 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 the code word indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. At 7:15 a.m., while Fukuda's first wave was still en route, and the radar operators at Opana were watching the massive return approach on their screen, the Japanese midget submarines, 5 of them, launched from fleet submarines the previous night, were making their final approaches to the harbor entrance. At 6:45 a.m., the USS Ward, a destroyer on patrol off the harbor entrance, had spotted one of these midget submarines and attacked it, sinking it with depth charges. The Ward sent an urgent report to 14th Naval District Headquarters. That report was received, was discussed, was delayed in transmission up the chain of command. By the time Admiral Kimmel was notified of it and began trying to verify what had happened, the first Japanese bombs were already falling. The Ward attack, an attack on a Japanese submarine by an American destroyer in peacetime waters at 6:45 a.m. on December 7th, was itself a warning, a genuine operational warning that something was wrong. It was received. It was not acted upon in time. Not because anyone was negligent in a crude sense, but because the machinery for translating an anomalous report into an emergency response did not work fast enough. The report went through channels. The channels took time. The time ran out. If you want to understand the full measure of what better advanced intelligence could have accomplished, this is where to look. Because even the warnings available on the morning of December 7th itself, the radar return, the submarine attack, were not translated into action in time to make a meaningful difference. The system was not calibrated for the speed at which the threat arrived, and it was not calibrated for that speed partly because the commanders who should have been calibrated had been told to look in a different direction, at a different kind of threat, and had not been given the specific intelligence that would have told them to be ready for precisely this. The attack itself was executed with extraordinary precision. The torpedo planes came in low over the water, releasing their modified shallow-running torpedoes in coordinated runs that struck the battleships from multiple angles before the anti-aircraft gunners could respond effectively. The high-level bombers, using specially designed armor-piercing bombs converted from battleship shells, struck the ships at their most vulnerable points. The dive bombers targeted the airfields at Hickam and Wheeler and Kanohe, destroying the American aircraft on the ground before they could be scrambled to intercept. The fighter escorts, in the Zero fighters that were at that point the finest carrier-based fighter aircraft in the world, swept the skies of any American aircraft that managed to get airborne. There were American pilots who fought back. There were sailors who manned their guns and fired back with everything they had. There were men who performed acts of extraordinary courage under conditions of complete chaos and complete surprise. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Ken Taylor managed to get their P-40s airborne from Holly-Waugh Field, a secondary airfield that the Japanese, apparently unaware of it, had not targeted, and between them shot down a total of 7 Japanese aircraft in the 2 hours of the attack. Their story is one of courage and improvisation under the most desperate conditions. But 2 P-40s against 350 Japanese aircraft was not a battle. It was a gesture. The second wave of 170 Japanese aircraft arrived at 8:54 a.m., when the first wave's attacks were already largely complete. They struck the facilities that the first wave had not fully destroyed: the dry docks, the fuel storage tanks, which, critically, the Japanese planners had deprioritized and which largely survived the attack, the repair shops, the submarines in port. The American anti-aircraft fire was more organized now, and the second wave lost more aircraft than the first. But the damage they added to that already inflicted by the first wave deepened the catastrophe. By 9:55 a.m., the last Japanese aircraft had turned north and the attack was over. The results were, from Japan's perspective, almost perfectly aligned with the plan. 8 battleships had been sunk or damaged. 3 cruisers had been damaged. 3 destroyers had been sunk or damaged. The airfields had been devastated. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed on the ground and 159 more damaged, leaving the American Air Forces in Hawaii almost completely neutralized. The harbor facilities and the repair infrastructure were seriously damaged. The Pacific Fleet's battleship force had been functionally eliminated as an offensive weapon for the foreseeable future. What Japan had not accomplished was the destruction of the American aircraft carriers. There were 3 carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet: the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga. On December 7th, the Enterprise was returning from Wake Island, where it had delivered a Marine fighter squadron. The Lexington was en route to Midway Island for a similar mission. The Saratoga was on the west coast of the United States, undergoing repair. None of them were in Pearl Harbor when the attack occurred, and none of them were targeted by Japanese aircraft. Their survival was not the result of any American foreknowledge or clever strategy. It was, from the American perspective, pure luck. From the Japanese perspective, it was a critical failure of the operation. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai, chose not to launch a third strike to search for and destroy the carriers. His reasons were sound by the conventions of carrier warfare as he understood it. His aircraft were low on fuel and ammunition from 2 attack waves. The carrier's location was unknown. The American shore-based air defenses, though badly damaged, were not completely eliminated, and the risk of surprise American counterattack made prolonged operations in those waters hazardous. Nagumo turned the fleet north and withdrew. In retrospect, the failure to destroy the American carriers at Pearl Harbor The failure, for which Yamamoto blamed Nagumo bitterly in private, was a decisive operational mistake of the entire war in the Pacific. The carriers survived a fight at Coral Sea and at Midway, where they inflicted on Japan the losses from which it never recovered. But these consequences were invisible on December 7, 1941. What was visible on December 7th was a harbor full of sunken ships and burning oil, the airfields littered with wrecked aircraft, the hospitals overwhelmed with the wounded, and the bodies of 2,403 Americans who had not woken up that Sunday morning expecting to die. In Washington, the news arrived during the early afternoon, East Coast time. Secretary Knox's disbelieving response, "My God, this can't be true. This must mean the Philippines," was probably echoed by every senior official who heard the first reports. It was Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's battleship force was gone. The base that was supposed to be the unsinkable fortress of American Pacific power had been struck and devastated in a single morning. Roosevelt convened his cabinet that evening. The room was grim. The men around the table understood what had happened and what it meant. America was at war, not just a half war, the undeclared naval engagement in the Atlantic that had been going on for months, but full, declared, total war. The political problem that had seemed insoluble, how to bring an isolationist public into a war it did not want, had been solved in 110 minutes by Japanese aircraft. The public was not isolationist anymore. The public was furious and united and ready. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day. His speech, the Day of Infamy speech, is among the most powerful in American presidential history. It was short, exactly 500 words, and it was delivered with controlled fury that communicated better than any elaborate rhetoric the enormity of what happened and the certainty of the American response. Congress declared war on Japan with one dissenting vote. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against American entry into World War I, and who would be the only member of Congress to vote against both declarations. Germany declared war on the United States 3 days later, as required by the terms of the Tripartite Pact, and the United States declared war on Germany and Italy in response. The global conflict that Roosevelt had been trying for 2 years to enter was now, inescapably, America's war. Whether the full intelligence picture that Washington possessed in November and December 1941 was consistent with the administration's genuine surprise at the Pearl Harbor attack is a question that the historical record answers with ambiguity. What is not ambiguous is that the response to the attack, the declaration of war, the mobilization of American industry and manpower, the strategic decisions that followed, was, in a fundamental sense, exactly what the Roosevelt administration had been working toward. The political problem that had blocked American entry into the war was gone. The isolationist opposition, which had been formidable as recently as November 1941, was shattered overnight. The war that Roosevelt believed America needed to fight was now a war that America demanded to fight. Whether that outcome justified the intelligence failures that preceded Pearl Harbor, or whether in some measure explains them, is a question that history cannot answer with the certainty that justice would require. The men who made the decisions that left Pearl Harbor unprotected are all gone. Their motivations, their calculations, their private awareness of what they knew and what they failed to do, these things went with them. What remains is the documents. And the documents tell a story that is more complicated and more disturbing than the one in the textbooks. The documents show that America was warned. They show that the warnings were read. They show that the men who read them made decisions, some defensible, some less so, some permanently unexplained, that together left 2,403 Americans unprotected on a Sunday morning in December. That is what the magic files show. That is what the bomb plot message shows. That is what Stimson's diary shows. That is what the congressional testimony shows. That is what the archives, taken together, have been showing us for more than 80 years. The question is whether we are prepared to look at what they show and to sit with the discomfort of history that does not resolve into clean moral clarity. A history that requires us to hold in our minds simultaneously the genuine heroism of the men who fought and died at Pearl Harbor, the genuine strategic excellence of the Japanese attack, the genuine organizational failures of the American intelligence community, and the genuinely unresolved questions about the decisions of specific powerful men in specific critical moments. and to acknowledge that all of these things are true at the same time, that they do not cancel each other out, and that the full truth of December 7th, 1941 requires all of them. That is what I've tried to give you today. Not a verdict, not a simple story. The full weight of the evidence, laid out as honestly as I know how to lay it out, and the questions that evidence raises, questions that are still worth asking 80 years later in the archival light of the red stamp files that were never supposed to be opened. The men on the Arizona are still there in the harbor, entombed in a ship that became their monument. The files are in the archives. The truth is available to anyone who wants it badly enough to go look. Go look. I want to spend some time now with the individual men, not the admirals, not the politicians, not the intelligence officers, but the men in the harbor on December 7th. Because history has a way of abstracting catastrophe, of reducing it to statistics and strategic assessments and bureaucratic failures. And in that abstraction, the human beings at the center of it can disappear. They should not disappear. They are the reason this story matters. Seaman James Anderson was 21 years old from Wahiawa, Hawaii. He was aboard the battleship California, manning a watertight hatch when the first torpedo struck. He spent 40 minutes below the flooding decks, helping wounded men toward escape hatches. Before being brought out himself, he survived. His ship didn't, not that day. The California sank at her moorings, taking 98 men with her. Anderson spent the rest of the war wondering about the men he couldn't get out in time. Pharmacist mate second-class Lee Susi was aboard the Utah, a former battleship that had been converted to a target ship and training vessel, and that was not on the Japanese target priority list, but was struck by torpedoes that may have been intended for the carriers that weren't there. The Utah capsized in 10 minutes. 58 men were trapped inside. Some of them were rescued by cutting holes in the hull. Some were not. Susi treated wounded on the dock for hours, working without adequate supplies, doing triage by experience and instinct. He was 24 years old. Ensign Donald Corn was aboard the destroyer USS Cassin, in dry dock with the Downs alongside her. When the dive bombers targeted the dry dock, a bomb struck the Cassin and detonated her torpedoes. The explosion blew the Cassin off her keel blocks and onto the Downs. Corn was thrown across the dock. He survived. Many of his crew did not. These men, and the 2,403 who did not survive, and the 1,178 who carried wounds, were the human cost of decisions made 3,000 miles away in Washington and 5,000 miles away in Tokyo. They are the measure of what intelligence failure means when it stops being an abstract institutional problem and becomes a human catastrophe. They are the reason that the questions about magic and the bomb plot message and the wind's code matter. Not as historical puzzles, not as ammunition in political argument, but as the questions of accountability that a democratic society owes to the men it sends into harm's way. The Arizona Memorial that floats above the sunken hull in Pearl Harbor receives more than 1 million visitors a year. They come from every country in the world. They stand above the wreck and look down through the clear water at the rusted steel and the oil that still seeps from the ship, a seep that the National Park Service calls the ship's tears, and most of them know the basic story. Japan attacked. America was surprised. The country rallied and won the war. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. What most of those visitors do not know, what the memorial does not tell them, what the official story has never fully acknowledged, is what the classified cables showed, what the warning said, what the specific decisions were that left the men in that harbor less protected than the available intelligence warranted. What they do not know is that the oil still seeping from the Arizona, those ships' tears, might have been prevented or at least reduced if the men responsible for the harbor's defense had been given the information their government possessed. That is not a comfortable thing to know. It is easier and it is more emotionally coherent to understand Pearl Harbor as a pure surprise, an act of treachery against an innocent and unsuspecting nation, a bolt from the blue that could not have been foreseen. That is the version that honors the dead without complicating them, that allows the sacrifice to be clean, that keeps the moral landscape of December 7th unclouded by the Messier truths of what happened in Washington in the weeks before. But the Messier truth is what the documents show. And honoring the men who died at Pearl Harbor means being willing to look at those documents, to acknowledge what they reveal, to hold the responsible parties accountable. Not in a court of law, The time for that passed long ago, but in the court of historical understanding, they deserve that much. They deserve the truth of what happened to them and why, even when that truth is difficult, even when it complicates the narrative, even when it requires us to look at the decisions of powerful men and say, this was not enough, this was not right, they deserve better than this. The men of the Arizona are still there. The documents are in the archives. The truth is available. Honor them by knowing it. There is one more thread I want to pull before I let you go, and it concerns what happened to the principal figures in this story in the years and decades after Pearl Harbor. Because history does not end on December 7th, 1941, and the lives of the men who lived through it, who made the decisions, who bore the consequences, who spent the rest of their lives defined by what happened on that Sunday morning, are themselves a kind of evidence about what Pearl Harbor meant and what it cost. Admiral Husband Kimmel was relieved of command 17 days after the attack. He spent the next 25 years fighting for his reputation, demanding access to classified files that had been withheld from him, insisting that he had been made a scapegoat for failures that originated in Washington. He testified before the Roberts Commission, before the Congressional Committee, and before multiple other inquiries. He hired lawyers. He wrote a memoir. He gave interviews. He was, by every account, consumed by the injustice of what had been done to him. Not the attack itself, which he understood as an operational reality, but the years of blame for a disaster that the classified record showed had been significantly enabled by decisions made in Washington by men who had information he was never given. Kimmel retired as a rear admiral, 2 grades below the 4-star rank he held at Pearl Harbor. He died in 1968, 3 years before the magic files were publicly released, still fighting for his reputation, still denied the full access to the classified record that would have vindicated him. His family continued to fight after his death. The 1995 Department of Defense report and the 2000 congressional resolution acknowledged that he had been unfairly blamed. The posthumous restoration of his 4-star rank, which the resolution called for, was never implemented. The Army Secretary at the time declined to act on the resolution, citing the complexity of the case. Kimmel died a 2-star admiral. He remains, in the official record, a 2-star admiral. General Walter Short fared similarly. He was relieved alongside Kimmel, reduced in grade, and spent years trying to clear his name. He died in 1949, having never received the official vindication he sought. His family, like Kimmel's, continued to press for posthumous recognition of his unfair treatment. The 2000 congressional resolution applied to Short as well as Kimmel, but the same refusal to implement it applied. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the man who had seized control of naval intelligence distribution, who had decided not to forward the bomb plot message, who had testified with such combative certainty before the Congressional Committee, had a remarkably successful wartime career. He commanded the amphibious forces at Guadalcanal and went on to command amphibious operations across the Pacific, culminating in the massive landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant amphibious commander. He retired as a full admiral, received numerous decorations, and died in 1961, his Pearl Harbor decisions long overshadowed by his wartime accomplishments. He never publicly acknowledged that his decision not to forward the bomb plot message had been wrong. William Friedman, the man who had broken the purple cipher and whose achievement had made magic possible, had a different kind of post-war life. He continued to work in signals intelligence, contributing to the foundation of the National Security Agency, which he had helped conceive. But the strain of the wartime cryptanalytic work, the years of 7-day weeks, the pressure, the secrecy, had taken a severe physical and psychological toll. He suffered a serious breakdown after the war and spent time in a psychiatric facility. He recovered and returned to work. But the man who had done what the Japanese believed was impossible carried the cost of that achievement in ways that the official record does not fully capture. J. Edgar Hoover, who had buried the Dusko Papa questionnaire and failed to pass its Pearl Harbor intelligence to the military, remained the director of the FBI until his death in 1972, 31 years after the attack. He was never questioned about the Pop-Out matter in any official forum. His role in the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure was not publicly documented until after his death, when his files began to be opened and researchers could reconstruct what happened. He died with his reputation for institutional dominance intact, The full measure of his Pearl Harbor failure not yet known. Henry Stimson continued as Secretary of War throughout the war, overseeing the mobilization of American military power and, ultimately, the decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan. He was 77 years old when the war ended. He retired from public life and died in 1950, leaving behind a diary that contained a November 25th entry about maneuvering Japan into firing the first shot. A diary that would not become publicly available until years after his death, and that would become one of the most debated documents in the Pearl Harbor literature. Franklin Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the war. He died on April 12, 1945, of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia, with the war in Europe only weeks from ending. He never testified about Pearl Harbor. He never addressed, in any public forum, the questions about what his administration knew and what it did with that knowledge. He died having led the nation to the greatest war in its history, having built a grand alliance that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, having presided over the greatest military mobilization in human history. His legacy is enormous, complex, and in its Pearl Harbor dimension, permanently incomplete. The war itself ended 4 years after Pearl Harbor. 4 years almost to the month. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Among the American officers present for surrender was Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had replaced Kimmel at the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor and who had commanded the naval forces that had fought their way across the Pacific to this moment. Also present at a distance were the ghosts of the 2,403 men who had died 4 years earlier in the harbor, whose name the Missouri and all the ships around her were avenging. The Missouri and the Enterprise and the Lexington and all the other ships that had won the Pacific War were, in a profound sense, the answer to Pearl Harbor, the answer that American industrial power and American military excellence had been building for 4 years. Yamamoto had been right to fear what he was unleashing. He had been killed in 1943, shot down over Bougainville by American P-38 fighters in an ambush made possible by, appropriately, signals intelligence that had revealed his flight itinerary. He died having seen the war turn irrevocably against Japan. He did not live to see the surrender. The war in the Pacific cost the United States approximately 111,000 killed in action, roughly 250,000 wounded, and losses of ships and aircraft that in their scale and ferocity exceeded anything that had previously been imagined. It cost Japan an estimated 2.1 to 3.1 million dead, including military personnel and civilians, with the atomic bombings accounting for between 129,000 and 226,000 of those deaths. The Pacific War was, by any measure, one of the most destructive episodes in human history, and it began on December 7th, 1941, in the harbor of a base whose defenders had not been given the intelligence their government possessed. That is the full accounting of what the magic files and the bomb plot message in Stimson's diary entry and Turner's decision and the Missing Winds code logs ultimately mean. They do not mean merely that some bureaucratic decisions went wrong on a Sunday morning in Hawaii. They are the first domino in a chain that led to 4 years of war, to Guadalcanal and Tarawa in Saipan, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people on both sides of the most terrible war the Pacific has ever seen. The classified cables that proved Washington knew about Pearl Harbor are not just historical curiosities. They are the origin point of a war and the measure of the cost of intelligence failure and the evidence of what democratic governments owe to the men and women they send into harm's way. Go look at them. Demand accountability for them. Remember the men in the harbor. And if this video gave you something to think about, if it changed the way you understand not just Pearl Harbor, but the relationship between governments and the people they're supposed to protect, please share it. Please like it. Please subscribe. This kind of history matters. It has always mattered. I will see you next week. Before I go, I want to leave you with one final image. It is December 7th, 1941, late afternoon, hours after the last Japanese aircraft has turned north toward the carrier fleet. The smoke is still rising from Battleship Row. The harbor is full of oil and wreckage and the unrecovered dead. Rescue parties are still working, still cutting into the hulls of capsized ships, still pulling men out of places that had become tombs. The sun is going down over the Waianae Range, painting the smoke orange and red, the way Hawaiian sunsets do, the way they still do today. Somewhere in Washington, in a room with a locked door and a magic stamp on the files pile on the desk, a man is sitting with the knowledge of what he knew and what he did not do with what he knew. We do not know exactly who that man is. We do not know exactly what he is thinking. We know only what the documents show, that the information was there, that the warnings were there, that the picture, incomplete but unmistakably alarming, was there, and that the men in the harbor were not told. The oil is still seeping from the Arizona. The questions are still open. The obligation to ask them honestly has not expired.